Thomas Williams walked into the small county courthouse, his crisp navy suit pressed and his leather briefcase held tightly against his side. The morning sunlight filtered through the old windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room watching him, some with curiosity, some with judgment. The courtroom was exactly as he had imagined, stuffy, intimidating, with rows of wooden benches and a raised platform where Judge Edward Roberts sat like a sentinel of justice. Thomas had seen countless courtrooms before, but today felt different. Today, he was not the federal prosecutor he usually was, but a defendant facing what seemed like an impossible situation. Earlier that week, Thomas had been driving home from a late meeting. His pristine Mercedes, a reward for years of hard work and dedication, was his pride and joy. He remembered the police lights flashing behind him, the sudden tension that gripped his body when the officer approached his window. License and registration, the officer had demanded, his tone sharp and aggressive. Thomas knew the routine. He moved slowly, carefully, keeping his hands visible at all times. He had learned these survival tactics years ago, lessons taught by his father and grandfather about how to survive as a black man in a system that often seemed designed to work against him. The traffic stop had been quick but uncomfortable. A broken taillight, they said. But Thomas knew his car was in perfect condition. He had just had it serviced the week before. Something felt off, but he remained calm and respectful. Now, sitting in the courtroom, he watched Judge Roberts review the paperwork. The judge was an older white man, probably in his late 60s, with steel-gray hair and glasses perched on the edge of his nose. His expression was stern, almost dismissive. "Mr. Williams," the judge's voice cut through the silence, "you are charged with resisting arrest and multiple traffic violations. The evidence suggests you were uncooperative during the traffic stop." Thomas could feel his heart racing, but he kept his composure. He knew every word, every gesture could be used against him. Years of legal training had taught him to be strategic, to remain calm under pressure. "Your Honor," Thomas began, his voice steady and clear, "I was completely cooperative during the entire interaction. I followed every instruction given to me." The judge seemed unimpressed. He shuffled through some papers, occasionally glancing up at Thomas with a look that seemed to suggest guilt before any real evidence had been presented. The prosecutor, a young woman who seemed eager to prove herself, presented what seemed like a rehearsed narrative. Traffic violations, potential resistance, a history of similar incidents. Thomas listened carefully, recognizing the subtle ways systemic bias could be woven into seemingly neutral language. As the proceedings continued, Thomas observed the dynamics of the courtroom. The subtle glances, the body language, the unspoken tensions that spoke volumes about the deeper issues at play. He wasn't just fighting a traffic ticket, he was confronting a system that had long marginalized people who looked like him. When the judge finally spoke his verdict, the words hung in the air like a heavy fog. A significant fine, mandatory community service, and a mark on his record that could potentially impact his professional career. £2,500 fine, Judge Roberts declared, his gavel coming down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the quiet courtroom. Thomas felt a mix of emotions, frustration, anger, but most importantly, a deep sense of determination. This was not just about a traffic ticket. This was about justice, about fairness, about challenging a system that too often presumed guilt based on skin color. As he sat there, Thomas knew something important: this was not the end of his story. This was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge perceptions, expose systemic biases, and potentially create meaningful change. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Thomas Williams sat perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead, already planning his next move. Thomas walked toward the court clerk's desk, his movements deliberate and calm. The courtroom buzzed with a low murmur of anticipation, people watching his every step. His hand moved slowly to his inner jacket pocket, fingers carefully extracting a small leather wallet. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and graying hair, looked up expecting another routine interaction. Thomas placed his federal identification on the counter, the official seal gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Her eyes widened. For a moment, time seemed to stop. "Excuse me," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. She turned towards Judge Roberts, who was preparing to exit the courtroom. "Your Honor," there's something you need to see." The judge paused, turning with an expression of mild irritation. The clerk held up Thomas's federal identification, her hand trembling slightly. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that happens when something significant is about to be revealed. Judge Roberts adjusted his glasses, leaning forward to examine the document. His face transformed from confident dismissal to complete shock. The deep lines around his eyes seemed to soften, then tighten with a mix of embarrassment and sudden realization. "Mr. Williams is a senior federal prosecutor for the United Kingdom District Court," the clerk announced, her voice now clear and loud enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear. Whispers erupted. Heads turned. Thomas remained standing, his posture straight, his expression neutral. He wasn't seeking drama or revenge. He was simply demanding the basic respect that should be afforded to every citizen, regardless of their skin color or professional status. The judge's previous confidence evaporated. The papers in his hand seemed to suddenly weigh 1,000 pounds. How could he have been so quick to judge? So ready to impose a fine and punishment without truly examining the facts? Thomas understood the dynamics of this moment. This wasn't just about him. This was about a system that often presumed guilt based on appearance, a system that needed to be challenged and changed. "Mr. Williams," Judge Roberts stammered, I apologize for the proceedings." But Thomas knew apologies were meaningless without genuine understanding and systemic change. His years as a federal prosecutor had taught him that real justice wasn't about individual moments, but about consistent, fair treatment. The courtroom felt electric. People were looking at Thomas with a mixture of admiration, shock, and newfound respect. A black man who had been moments away from being unjustly fined was actually a high-ranking legal professional. Some lawyers in the room nodded subtly. They recognized the significance of this moment, a living, breathing example of the biases that existed within the judicial system. Thomas wasn't just a victim, he was a catalyst for potential change. The court clerk kept looking at the federal identification, as if verifying its authenticity. Her hand shook slightly, understanding the weight of what had just transpired. A potential miscarriage of justice had been narrowly avoided. Judge Roberts shuffled his papers, his earlier authoritative demeanor completely dismantled. The power dynamics in the room had dramatically shifted. The man who moments ago sat in judgment was now the one being judged by the very system he represented. Thomas remained calm. He had seen scenarios like this before, moments where systemic prejudice was suddenly and dramatically exposed. He wasn't interested in humiliating anyone. His goal was always education, understanding, and progress. As the initial shock began to settle, Thomas knew this moment would become more than just a personal victory. It would be a story shared in legal circles, a teaching moment about unconscious bias, about the dangers of making quick judgments based on appearances. The revelation was complete. The courtroom, once a place of potential injustice, had become a space of unexpected truth and potential transformation. Thomas Williams picked up his federal identification, tucked it carefully back into his wallet, and waited for what would happen next. His journey was far from over. The courthouse hallway felt narrow and suffocating as Thomas Williams and Judge Roberts stood facing each other. Other legal professionals and court staff watched from a distance, sensing the tension between them. "Mr. Williams," Judge Roberts began, his voice uncertain, "I would like to explain." Thomas raised his hand slightly, a gesture that immediately stopped the judge mid-sentence. His eyes were not angry, but intense and calculating. Years of legal experience had taught him that moments like these required careful navigation. "Your Honor," Thomas said quietly, "this isn't about a personal apology. This is about understanding a much larger problem." The judge shifted uncomfortably. He was used to being in control, used to making decisions that went unchallenged. Now, he found himself in unfamiliar territory, being confronted with his own unconscious bias. Thomas continued, his voice calm but firm. "What happened today isn't an isolated incident. It's a systemic issue that affects countless individuals who don't have the professional credentials to challenge such treatment." Several nearby lawyers nodded subtly. They recognized the truth in Thomas's words. The judicial system had long been plagued by unconscious racial biases that went unaddressed. Judge Roberts looked defeated. He had built a reputation as a fair and just judge, and now that reputation was being publicly challenged. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "I never intended," he started, but Thomas interrupted gently. "Intention isn't the point," Thomas explained. "The point is understanding how unconscious biases impact real people's lives. How a simple traffic stop can become a life-changing moment of potential injustice." The hallway was silent. Everyone was listening, watching this powerful conversation unfold. Thomas wasn't seeking revenge or public humiliation. He was seeking understanding and change. A young court clerk standing nearby seemed particularly moved. Her eyes were wide, absorbing every word of this unexpected lesson in systemic inequality. Judge Roberts took a deep breath. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice surprisingly humble. Thomas smiled slightly. This was the moment of potential transformation. "Education," he said simply. "Unconscious bias training. Real, meaningful conversations about how we perceive and treat people." The judge nodded, understanding that this was more than just a personal interaction. This was an opportunity for genuine growth and systemic change. "I would like to invite you to speak at our judicial training sessions," Judge Roberts suggested, "to help other judges understand these issues." Thomas considered the offer. It wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about creating meaningful dialogue and understanding. "I accept," he said finally. As they shook hands, the watching court staff seemed to collectively exhale. Something important had just happened. A moment of potential conflict had transformed into an opportunity for learning and growth. The hallway, once tense and uncomfortable, now felt like a space of hope. Thomas Williams had turned a moment of potential injustice into a powerful teaching opportunity. Walking away, Thomas knew this was just the beginning. One conversation couldn't fix centuries of systemic inequality. But it was a start. A small but significant step towards understanding, empathy, and real change. The courthouse continued its daily rhythm, but something had subtly shifted. A conversation had happened that would ripple through the legal community, challenging long-held assumptions and inviting deeper reflection. Thomas Williams had done more than challenge a traffic ticket. He had challenged a system, with dignity, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The confrontation was over. The real work was just beginning. The conference hall buzzed with anticipation. Hundreds of legal professionals, judges, and law enforcement officers sat quietly, waiting for Thomas Williams to speak. His reputation had spread quickly after the courthouse incident, and everyone wanted to hear his story. Thomas walked to the podium, his navy blue suit crisp and professional. He looked calm, almost serene, despite knowing the weight of this moment. This wasn't just a speech. This was an opportunity to create real change. "We talk about justice," he began, his voice clear and steady, "but justice isn't just about laws. It's about understanding." The audience leaned forward. Thomas shared his personal experience, not with anger, but with a compassionate understanding that touched everyone's heart. He spoke about the traffic stop, the courtroom, and the moment of revelation. Young lawyers scribbled notes. Experienced judges listened intently. Thomas wasn't just telling a story, he was providing a masterclass in systemic bias and human understanding. "Every interaction is an opportunity to see humanity," he explained. "Not as categories or stereotypes, but as individual human beings." His words resonated deeply. The room felt electric, charged with potential for transformation. Thomas wasn't just criticizing the system, he was offering a path forward. During the break, senior judges approached him. They wanted to understand, to learn. Thomas listened carefully, answering questions with patience and wisdom. A senior judicial trainer named Robert approached. "We want to develop a comprehensive unconscious bias training program," he said. "Would you be willing to help design it?" Thomas smiled. This was exactly the kind of productive conversation he had hoped would emerge from his experience. Over the next few months, Thomas worked closely with judicial training departments. He wasn't just a consultant, he was a catalyst for change. The training program they developed would be implemented across multiple court districts. The program wasn't about blame. It was about awareness. About understanding how unconscious biases can impact professional judgment. About recognizing human dignity in every interaction. News of Thomas's work spread quickly. Legal journals wrote articles. Professional conferences invited him to speak. What could have been a moment of personal frustration had become a national conversation about fairness and understanding. Young law students began following his work. They saw him as more than a federal prosecutor. He was a role model, someone who transformed a negative experience into a positive force for change. Thomas never sought personal glory. His motivation was simple: create a more just system. A system where a person's worth wasn't determined by their appearance, but by their character and actions. The judicial training program became a model for other institutions. Police departments, government agencies, educational institutions all began looking at Thomas's approach as a blueprint for meaningful change. During one training session, a young white judge approached Thomas. "You've changed how I think about my work," she said, her eyes filled with genuine emotion. Thomas understood that change happens one conversation at a time. One moment of understanding. One person deciding to see beyond their own limited perspective. His family was proud. His father, who had experienced significant racial discrimination in his lifetime, saw this as a victory not just for Thomas, but for an entire generation. "You're doing the work we could only dream about," his father told him during a quiet family dinner. Thomas knew the journey was far from over. Systemic change is slow, incremental. But every step matters. Every conversation counts. As he reflected on the past months, Thomas felt a sense of hope. Not a naive hope, but a realistic, grounded hope born from hard work and genuine human connection. The turning point wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for understanding, for empathy, for the belief that people can change when given the right information and approached with respect. Thomas Williams had transformed a moment of potential injustice into a powerful movement of education and transformation. And this was just the beginning point. 1 year after the courthouse incident, Thomas Williams stood in a modern training center, watching a new group of judges and legal professionals complete their unconscious bias workshop. The room was filled with diverse faces, young and old, different backgrounds, various experiences. Judge Roberts, who had once been the source of Thomas's legal challenge, now sat in the front row. His presence was symbolic, a living example of personal growth and institutional change. The training program they had developed together had become a national model. It wasn't about making people feel guilty. It was about creating awareness, understanding, and empathy. Thomas walked around the room, observing participants discussing complex scenarios. They were learning to recognize their own biases, to question automatic assumptions, to see beyond surface-level differences. "Every person has a story," Thomas would often say during these sessions. "Our job is to listen, to understand, to create space for that story." The participants worked through role-play scenarios, practicing how to approach potentially challenging interactions with respect and openness. They learned communication techniques that emphasized listening over judgment. During a break, a young police officer approached Thomas. "Your work has changed how I think about my job," he said, his voice sincere. "I used to see interactions as me versus them. Now I see them as human connections." Thomas smiled. These were the moments that made all the hard work worthwhile. Small transformations that could lead to significant systemic changes. The training wasn't just theoretical. Participants were required to implement what they learned, to track their progress, to be accountable for their growth. It was a comprehensive approach to understanding and dismantling unconscious bias. Local courts began reporting positive changes. Fewer unnecessary confrontations. More respectful interactions. A gradual but significant shift in how justice was approached and delivered. Thomas's work had caught national attention. He was invited to speak at major legal conferences, to consult with government agencies, to help design more inclusive training programs. But for Thomas, it was never about personal recognition. It was about creating meaningful change. About ensuring that the legal system became a true instrument of justice for everyone, regardless of their background. His family watched his journey with pride. His father, who had experienced significant racial discrimination in his lifetime, saw this as a victory for an entire generation. "You're doing the work we could only dream about," his father would tell him during quiet family dinners. The training program expanded. What started in one courthouse had now become a national initiative. Other professionals, teachers, healthcare workers, corporate leaders, began adapting similar approaches. Thomas continued his work as a federal prosecutor, but now he had an additional mission. He was not just enforcing the law. He was helping to reshape how the law was understood and applied. During one session, a participant asked him, "How do you stay hopeful?" Thomas's response was simple: change happens one conversation at a time. One moment of understanding. One person deciding to see beyond their own limited perspective. His approach was never about anger or blame. It was about education, empathy, and genuine human connection. The judicial system was slowly transforming. Not through radical changes, but through consistent, intentional efforts to understand and respect human dignity. As the training session concluded, participants applauded. But for Thomas, the real applause was in the subtle shifts he saw in attitudes, in understanding, in approach. He looked around the room. Faces of different ages, backgrounds, experiences, all united by a common goal of creating a more just, more understanding world. Thomas Williams had turned a moment of potential injustice into a powerful movement of transformation. What began as a personal challenge had become a national conversation about fairness, respect, and human understanding. And this was just the beginning.